Our next lesson is on translating graphs. We're going to take some basic graphs and move them all around our coordinate plane. But to do that, we are actually going to play around with our calculators a little bit. So I need you to take some time now and get out your calculator. If you don't have one of your own, please make sure that you're sitting with a partner or someone who does. So go ahead and grab those calculators. We'll start out with just a standard window. Go to your y equals, and we're going to enter in an equation here. What I'd like you to enter in first of all is an x squared, y equals x squared graph. Okay, so on your y equals x squared graph, here's our basic parabola. You can see that we're centered at the origin. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start moving this graph around. I'm going to take this parabola and move it around to different places. And I'm going to enter in the equation to move it, and I'm going to see if you can figure out how to do the same thing. So basically what you will be trying to do is match my graph. So the next graph that I want you to work on will be the parabola, but in a new position. Let me enter this graph in. Okay, here's our new graph. The parabola in a new position. What I'd like you to do is on your calculator, see if you can somehow manipulate that equation, that y equals x squared. Do something to it so that your graph matches my graph. So with this graph, as you worked either by yourself or with a partner as you were playing around with it, I hope you found that you could move your parabola up by adding a number to it. And to match this graph, it was adding a 2. So I have y equals x squared plus 2. Okay, next graph. I'm going to have you try to match here's your next graph. Same parabola. This one's shifted downward on the y-axis. See if you can match our graph here. After you get the first one, the second one probably was a little easier. So you could see that shifting down was y equals x squared minus 2. Now as we go through these, I want you to kind of keep in mind what it's taking to move a graph a certain direction. Okay, our next equation might not be so easy for you. See if I can get the next graph up for you. Okay, here's your next graph. Okay, this graph again takes the parabola, but you'll notice that it's shifted left and right on the x-axis. See if you can match that one. This one takes a little bit more thinking as we go through this. Play around with a few different things. You'll notice then, for those of you who were able to match this graph, that my equation for this actually requires parentheses. I'll give you a little hint. If you haven't got it yet, there's your hint. It requires parentheses. Try to match my graph. So now that you have matched my graph, you'll see that the equation for this one was y equals the quantity x minus 2 in parentheses squared. So the square went outside the set of parentheses, and we used x minus 2 to shift it to the right. Now we're going to come back and talk about these things in a little more detail, but remember, keep those in mind, what it takes to move your graph different places. Okay, so here's our next graph. Let me get our next graph up here. Deselect that one and get our next one entered in. Okay, here's our next graph. See if you can match this graph. Keeping it pretty simple. So after the previous one, the difference here is that we moved to the left on the x-axis, and using the same hint as we had before, this one also will take parentheses. You'll find then that the equation for this graph was y equals the quantity x plus 2 squared. Okay, next graph. We'll continue on here. Okay, here's our next graph. See if you can match this graph. This time, it's the parabola that we've been working with, but it's upside down. What can you do? Get your parabola flipped upside down. Some of you may have figured this out earlier when you were trying to get it to move other places. You may have already found this. But the negative in front of the x squared, that negative multiplier, you could put a -1 or just the negative, but the negative is what flips us upside down. In other words, it's reflecting it over the x-axis. Okay? So now that you know some basic how to shift things up and down and left and right, and how to flip it over the x-axis, let's try our next equation. Let's see if I can get that one entered in. We'll try our next equation that's going to do a combination of things. So you're going to have to look very carefully at our graph, at my graph, and see if you can get yours to look like this. Here's our next graph. So there's a few different things that have happened here. See if you can make all of those come together in an equation. Good. So you notice that on this graph we had to shift to the left 4 spaces. So we're going to have to deal with that. And then we shifted our parabola up 3 spaces. So we took what used to be at the origin, that vertex that used to be at the origin, we shifted that left 4 and up 3. So our equation for that was y equals x plus 4 squared in the parentheses, and then plus 3 added to the end. Okay, our next equation, let's try another one. We'll get another one up here for you to work on. Okay, here's your next graph. Okay, try to make your graph match my graph. So you see that what used to be at the origin has been shifted to the right 2 spaces, down 1, and it's been flipped over the x-axis. So in order to take care of all of those things, I would have y equals negative, you could list it as a -1 or just a negative, then I put the parentheses in, x minus 2, shifted it to the right, so x minus 2 squared. Let's see, what do we have then? Minus 1, we'll drop it down. So our equation was y equals negative quantity x minus 2 squared minus 1. All right, here's our last one. Let's try this one. One more. See what we can do with this. All right, there's our last graph. See if you can match this graph. Okay, so let's go ahead and write out a few specific rules that we learned as we were playing Match the Graph. Let's go ahead and go over here to the document camera now and write out some of our rules.